Hey guys, tonight we're cracking open the sealed tomb of one of history's most magnificent, most theatrical, and most genuinely strange civilizations. Ancient Egypt, a place so committed to permanence that they built mountains out of solid stone so their kings could sleep in them forever. A place that invented bureaucracy, standardized bread, and the concept of a work week, and then celebrated all three by drinking staggering quantities of beer. A place where cats walked the streets like they owned them. Priests shaved their entire bodies every 3 days for reasons of ritual purity. And the official royal medical title of one palace specialist was, without irony or apology, Shepherd of the Anus. We'll get there. So before you settle in, take a second to like the video and subscribe, but only if you actually enjoy what I do here. Drop a comment telling me where you're listening from and whether you've ever actually wanted to live in ancient Egypt after watching a documentary about it. Because I promise that by the end of tonight, you will have thoroughly reconsidered that ambition. I read them all. Mostly because I can't sleep either. Now dim those lights. Switch on a fan for that soft background hum. Maybe grab a blanket. The Egyptian desert drops temperature fast once the sun goes down, and the ancient Egyptians wrapped themselves in linen for exactly that reason. So consider it historically accurate cosplay. Let's ask the big questions. Have you ever wondered what it would actually feel like to live in one of the most organized civilizations in human history, where the floods came on schedule, the taxes arrived on schedule, and the gods were so numerous that no matter what you needed, there was a specific deity assigned to it? What was it like to eat bread every single day of your life, knowing full well that the sand ground into the grain during milling was quietly destroying your teeth, and also knowing that it didn't matter because everyone's teeth looked exactly the same, including the pharaohs? Did you know that ancient Egyptian medicine was in some ways astonishingly advanced, but also contained remedies involving crocodile dung, dead mouse paste, and at least one cure for baldness that combined the fat of 6 different animals and achieved nothing except making the bald man smell very strange? Was beer really the foundational food group of Egyptian society, drunk at breakfast, lunch, dinner, and handed out to workers instead of wages? Yes. Unambiguously yes. The pyramid builders were paid partially in beer. This is not a myth. This is an audited government record on real papyrus. What happened to you if you accidentally killed a sacred cat? What was the actual daily schedule of a temple priest? And what exactly did Ramesses II put on every monument he encountered, including several he definitely didn't build himself? Spoiler, his name. Let's find out. Congratulations. You've just woken up in 1279 BC in the city of Thebes, the beating religious heart of Egypt, built on the east bank of the Nile, thick with incense and priests and papyrus and the distant sound of someone hammering your pharaoh's name onto a wall he had nothing to do with constructing. You're a person of middling status. Not a slave, not a nobleman, not a high priest. You are somewhere in the broad, noisy, beer-scented middle of one of the most organized, most ritualized, and most aesthetically committed civilizations in human history. And you have things to do. Outside your window, the Nile glitters. Inside your window, your cat is already awake and staring at you with the focused intensity of a being who has decided this is the hour, and it is time for you to get up and there will be consequences. Her name is Bastet. You did not choose this name. She arrived 3 years ago, and the name simply occurred to you in a moment of what felt like divine suggestion. You have since come to believe she may have had something to do with it. Good luck, your house. Your home is a mud brick box. This is not an insult. Almost everyone in Egypt lives in a mud brick box, and yours is a perfectly respectable one. 2 stories, white plastered walls, a flat roof you sleep on in summer when the heat makes the interior unbearable, a small courtyard at the front where a palm tree grows at an optimistic angle and drops dates on the heads of visitors who don't know to stand slightly to the left. The bricks are made from Nile mud mixed with straw and sand and dried in the sun, which means they're essentially free because the Nile provides the mud and the sun provides the drying. And both of those have been on the Egyptian payroll since the beginning of time. The walls are thick, which is crucial. Egyptian summers reach temperatures that would give modern air conditioning systems an existential crisis. Thick mud brick walls absorb the heat slowly and release it at night, meaning your house is cool during the day and warm after sunset, which is exactly backwards from what you'd want if you built it out of stone, which is why only temples and tombs are built from stone. The things that need to last forever get granite and limestone. The things you actually live in get dried mud. Eternity and comfort have always operated on slightly different schedules. Your ground floor has 3 main rooms. The front room, which opens onto the courtyard, is where you receive guests, conduct small transactions, and do the kind of semi-public neighborly existing that daily life in a dense urban Egyptian neighborhood requires. The middle room is where you eat, and where the household altar lives, a small painted niche in the wall containing a figurine of Bes, the household god. Bes is stumpy and fierce-faced, and entirely unlike the serene animal-headed deities who populate the great temples. He has a lion's mane, a protruding tongue, bow legs, and the general appearance of a being who got into a fight with a more handsome god and won through sheer determination. He protects the home, particularly women in childbirth and sleeping children. He does this by being so visually alarming that evil spirits avoid the house on aesthetic grounds. He is, in a sense, the bouncer of the domestic world. You light a small lamp in front of him every morning. He has, so far, held up his end. The back room is the kitchen, a clay oven built into one corner, a grinding stone for grain that is always slightly gritty underfoot no matter how many times you sweep, several large ceramic storage pots for grain and oil and beer sealed with cloth stoppers, and a permanent layer of smoke staining the ceiling that no amount of whitewash has ever successfully addressed. The smoke has opinions. The smoke is winning. Upstairs is where you sleep, in a room just large enough for a wooden bed frame strung with a woven cord, not unlike a hammock stretched over a frame, a carved wooden headrest, a small chest for linens, and Bastet, who has claimed the center of the sleeping surface as sovereign territory and tolerates your presence on the edges through gritted whiskers. Let's talk about the headrest. You sleep with your neck resting on a carved wooden support, an arc of polished acacia or tamarisk, raised about 4 inches off the surface, that keeps your head elevated and your neck canted at an angle that looks, to a modern observer, profoundly uncomfortable. And you know what? It is at first. For the first few weeks of your life, you spent complaining about it. And then something shifted, and now you can't sleep without it. The way people become dependent on a specific pillow configuration and will travel with it wrapped in a cloth like a religious relic. The headrest serves two purposes. First, the practical. It lifts your head away from the sleeping surface, creating a gap between your skull and the mat that makes it harder for scorpions, sand fleas, and the various nocturnal acquaintances that share your house to crawl into your ears during the night. This is a genuine concern in this climate and this era, and the headrest addresses it with the elegant simplicity that characterizes Egyptian problem solving at its best. Second, the spiritual. The headrest protects the sleeper's head, the seat of the senses, the gateway to dreams, from malevolent forces that enter through the ears and eyes and nose during sleep. Many headrests are inscribed with protective spells. Several in the royal collection are made from alabaster and gold and carved with images of Bes crouching at either end, doing his alarming face at anything that approaches. Whether the headrest actually repels scorpions more effectively than a simple pillow is something you can test empirically. Whether it repels demons is harder to measure. The headrests keep appearing every morning, undisturbed. The dreams are mostly fine. Draw your own conclusions. Bastet has no interest in headrests. She has the whole center of the bed, and she sleeps the way she does everything, with complete authority and without apology. The morning, the sun rises over the Nile, and the city wakes in layers. The priests were up before you were awake, long before. The temples run on a schedule keyed to the movements of stars and sun, which means the morning rituals begin in the dark, and the junior priests responsible for the first duties of the day were fumbling through stone corridors by lamplight while you were still in negotiation with your headrest. The bakers woke before even the priests, because bread doesn't care about your spiritual schedule. The fishermen were on the river before dawn, before the bakers, before anyone. The Nile fish run early, and the Nile does not adjust its preferences to human convenience. You stand on your rooftop in the pale early light and look out over Thebes. And what you see is a city that looks and smells and sounds like nothing currently existing on Earth. The East Bank, your side, is the city of the living. Houses pressed together in the density of ancient urban neighborhoods, white and cream and ochre plastered, their rooftops forming an irregular landscape of sleeping figures and drying laundry and small awnings. Beyond the housing neighborhoods, the market streets, the craftsmen's quarters, the great processional avenues lined with sphinxes that connect the major temple complexes. Karnak, on the northern end of the city, a complex so large it contains multiple temples, a sacred lake, a forest of towering pylons and columned halls, and what amounts to a small town of priests and administrators and storage facilities. Luxor Temple, connected to Karnak by an avenue of sphinxes that stretches for 2 miles, and on festival days is lined with torches and crowds and the noise of a civilization celebrating its own magnificence. The river is already busy even at this hour. Fishing. Boats with triangular sails tacking back across the current. A transport barge low in the water with stone blocks, heading north toward a construction site that is probably adding something to something that already has Ramesses' name on it. A royal vessel with its gilded canopy folded, moving efficiently toward the palace quay. Small craft darting between them. The Nile is a highway, has always been a highway, and the traffic on it never quite stops. Across the water, on the west bank, the cliffs of the Theban hills rise pale and dramatic in the early light, and at their feet and carved into them is the city of the dead, mortuary temples, necropolis workers' villages, the valley of the kings, up in those limestone cliffs, full of tunneled tombs containing the remains of pharaohs going back 2 centuries. The great Ramesseum, Ramesses' own mortuary temple, already enormous, still being added to, the walls being carved with battle reliefs that depict the Hittite campaign with a degree of retrospective optimism that would impress the boldest modern political communications team. You look at it every morning and feel the particular Egyptian feeling that has no exact modern equivalent, but is something like, I am temporary, and the stone is forever, and that is the correct arrangement, and I should go eat bread. Hygiene. Before anything else, hygiene. Not because you're particularly fussy, but because Egypt makes hygiene non-optional in a way that northern climates simply don't understand. It is warm here, consistently and aggressively warm. It is dusty. There is sand in places that sand has no geographical reason to be. Without regular washing, the combination of heat and desert, and the general biological consequences of being a living person in a pre-industrial city, becomes, rapidly, a social problem. You wash with natron, a naturally occurring salt compound that Egypt produces in extraordinary quantities from dry lake deposits in the desert, particularly the Wadi Natrun west of the delta. Natron functions as soap, alkaline, slightly abrasive, effective at cutting oil and bacteria, and available in large quantities at reasonable cost. Dissolved in water, it makes a wash solution. In dry form, it can be used as a scrub. Its range of applications extends well beyond the living. Natron is also the primary preserving agent in the mummification process, packing the body cavity and desiccating the tissues over 70 days. It cleans the living and preserves the dead, which makes it one of history's most versatile materials, occupying a shelf in your kitchen and a vat in the embalmer's workshop with equal equanimity. You shave. If you're a man of any social standing in Thebes in 1279 BC, you shave every day, your face and very likely your head. The wig goes on afterward, a well-made human hair wig, oiled and combed and stored on a wooden stand when not in use, that signals your status by its quality and construction. Yours is a respectable mid-range wig, appropriately layered, not the elaborate many-braided confection of a nobleman, but certainly not the cheap plant fiber imitation that the very poor wear. Priests, and you pass several of them on the street every morning, are shaved across the entire body every 3 days. Full shaving. Head, face, chest, legs, everything. This is a purity requirement for temple service. Body hair is associated with animal nature, with the non-divine, with the chaos that temple ritual is designed to hold at bay. A priest entering the inner sanctuary of a god must be as physically purified as possible, which means shaved, bathed, chewing natron, dressed in fresh white linen, and having abstained from various categories of foods and activities for a prescribed period beforehand. The logistics of maintaining a large temple staff in this state of constant purity is a significant administrative operation. There are rotas, Then, coal. Both men and women line their eyes with coal, finely ground galena or stibnite, a gray-black mineral powder that the Egyptians prepare with the same attention to quality that they bring to any important cosmetic or medicinal substance. You keep yours in a small carved alabaster pot with a narrow neck and apply it with a thin wooden stick, drawing the line along the lash line and extending it past the outer corner of the eye in the angled sweep that has, 3,000 years from now, appeared on every Halloween Cleopatra costume that has ever existed. Here, it is not a costume choice. It performs at least 3 functions simultaneously, which is very Egyptian. Practically, the dark pigment reduces the glare of sunlight reflected off the Nile and off the desert sand, functioning as the ancient equivalent of the black eye stripes that baseball players apply. And for exactly the same reason. Medically, galena has mild antibacterial and antiparasitic properties that provide some protection against the eye. Infections that are genuinely common in a warm, dusty, fly-adjacent environment. The ancient Egyptians didn't know this in microbial terms, but they had empirically noticed over centuries that coal-wearing eyes got fewer infections, which was sufficient evidence. Aesthetically, it looks extraordinary, and the Egyptians are a people who have never once in their history been unwilling to combine the practical with the beautiful, and who will always choose the more elaborate option if given the choice. Bastet, born with perfectly lined eyes and no need for coal, observes the application process with the satisfied expression of a being who got there first. Then you get dressed. This takes approximately 4 seconds. Linen, white linen. Egypt's wardrobe is built on a single material, produced in such quantity and quality that it satisfies every sartorial requirement from work clothes to royal ceremonial dress by varying only the fineness of the weave and the elaborateness of the pleating. Your daily linen is a length of cloth wrapped around the waist and secured, or a longer piece draped and pinned at the shoulder. Simple, cool, quick to launder in river water, and appropriate to your profession. For formal occasions or feast days, finer linen with more careful pleating. For the very wealthy, linen so fine it's described by ancient writers as woven air, translucent as mist, soft as nothing, priced accordingly. No buttons, no decisions about what goes with what, because everything is white linen and it all goes with everything, because it is all the same. You will have sand in your sandals within 3 minutes of leaving the house. This is the one constant of Egyptian life across all social classes and is not considered worth mentioning because it requires no mention. The sand is everywhere. The sand has always been everywhere. The sand will be here when everyone else is gone. Breakfast. Breakfast in ancient Egypt is bread and beer. Bread and beer. Every day. For everyone. This is not poverty. This is not desperation. This is the cornerstone of the Egyptian diet and a deliberate, nutritionally considered choice. Both the nobleman and the laborer start their day with versions of the same 2 things, with the nobleman's bread being finer and his beer being stronger, and both of them being, fundamentally, doing the same thing. The bread is made from emmer wheat or barley, ground on the stone quern in your back kitchen. Emmer wheat is the ancient ancestor of modern durum wheat, shorter, tougher, more resistant to drought, less productive per acre, but manageable in Egyptian conditions. You or Nefret, your wife, will meet her properly later. Ground grain last evening and the flour is ready. Mixed with water and a handful of salt and sometimes a splash of oil or honey or dates depending on your mood and your supplies, shaped into flat rounds or small domed loaves and baked in the clay oven. The smell of baking bread in the early morning is the same smell. It will be 3,000 years from now, warm and yeasty and entirely welcome. The bread is good. The bread is also embedded within its deliciousness, slowly destroying your teeth. This is the grit problem. Stone querns, no matter how carefully tended, shed particles of stone and sand into the flour as they grind. The grinding stones are sandstone or granite, hard, abrasive, and fragments of them end up in every batch of flour, mixed invisibly through the grain, and then baked into every loaf, and then chewed into every set of teeth in Egypt. This grit, consumed every day for decades, wears the enamel from teeth with a patience and thoroughness that no modern dentist wants to contemplate. Archaeologists examining Egyptian mummies and skeletal remains find the same pattern regardless of social class or era. Worn teeth, badly worn teeth, teeth ground down to stumps by midlife, dental abscesses, bone loss around the teeth consistent with chronic infection. The pharaoh's teeth look like the peasant's teeth because they ate the same bread from the same kind of stones. Ramesses II, a man who built half the monuments in Egypt, who commanded armies, who negotiated peace treaties with empires, who fathered over 90 children. Ramesses had terrible teeth. He apparently lived to his 90s anyway. Proof that inconvenience and longevity are not mutually exclusive. The beer is the other half of breakfast, and it needs a proper moment of consideration. Egyptian beer is not the beer you know. It does not come in a cold glass with a head of foam. It is thick, opaque, sweet-sour, grain-heavy, and drunk through a long reed straw that filters the sediment, of which there is a great deal. It is made from partially baked grain cakes, called bapir, crumbled into water, mixed with fresh malt, allowed to ferment with wild yeasts for a day or two, then strained and consumed while still actively fermenting. The alcohol content is modest by modern standards, roughly equivalent to a light beer, but the caloric and nutritional density is significant. Egyptian beer is closer to liquid bread than to a recreational drink. It provides calories, carbohydrates, B vitamins, and the kind of mild, sustained energy that gets you through a morning of physical labor without requiring the sort of coffee infrastructure that won't exist for another 2,000 years. It also has one non-obvious but genuinely critical property. It is safer to drink than the water. The Nile is a river that several million people and animals use simultaneously for every conceivable purpose. Drinking from it directly, without boiling or treatment, is an invitation to a range of waterborne pathogens: cholera bacteria, typhoid, intestinal parasites, that will kill you at a speed that the beer drinker, blissfully unaware of germ theory, will never have to experience. Fermentation creates an acidic, alcohol-containing environment hostile to many of these pathogens. A jar of beer is, from a public health perspective, a jar that has been partially sterilized by the brewing process. The ancient Egyptians had no idea why the beer kept people healthier than the unboiled water. They knew that it did. They responded to this empirical observation by ensuring that everyone drank beer: men, women, children, pregnant women, the elderly, the sick. Beer is issued to workers as part of their wages. The standard ration for a laboring man on a state project is 10 loaves and about 2 gallons of beer per day. State records, actual audited accounts on papyrus, document the beer allocations for pyramid construction crews with the same bureaucratic precision applied to grain stores and copper tools. This is not legend, this is payroll. You drink your morning beer from a tall ceramic jar, pulling it through your reed straw, eat half a loaf of bread with a smear of oil, and tear a date from the cluster you bought yesterday. Bastet receives a small piece of yesterday's fish because Bastet has a contract and the terms are non-negotiable. Your neighbor, Ahmos. Your neighbor Ahmos is already in the street when you step out, and he is, as always, ready to tell you about his taxes. Ahmos is a sandal maker. A good one, actually. His workshop is 2 doors down from your house. His reputation is solid in the neighborhood, and his products are comfortable and durable in a climate that destroys footwear through the combined forces of sand, heat, and the aggressive geometry of unpaved streets. He has a wife named Merit, a common name, 3 Merits within a 5-minute walk. 3 children whose names all end in Hotep, in a way that he swears was not intentional, and a persistent, deep, personal conviction that his taxes are unjust. In this, Ahmose is in the great tradition of every Egyptian who has ever lived, which is to say, every Egyptian who has ever lived has felt their taxes were unjust, and they were all at least partially right. Egypt did not invent taxation in the sense of having been the first civilization to demand goods from its subjects. What Egypt did was systematize it, professionalize it, deploy it through a specialized administrative class with trained assessors, standardized measurement, official records, and a chain of reporting that ran from the village level up through regional offices to the royal treasury with the kind of bureaucratic thoroughness that other ancient civilizations were still developing. The taxes are paid not in money. Egypt doesn't use coinage yet, not for centuries, but in goods: grain, linen, copper, livestock, labor. Every harvest season, assessors travel the country measuring fields with knotted rope, the origin possibly of what we now call a surveyor, counting animals, valuing craft output, and recording everything on papyrus with reed brushes dipped in black or red ink. The records go to the scribal offices. The scribal offices compile regional totals. The totals inform the royal granaries and warehouses. Egypt's state economy is, in this sense, more thoroughly documented than the economies of many modern nations were 3 centuries ago. Ahmose's sandal tax is assessed based on estimated annual production from his workshop. Last year, Ahmose says, and this morning he is telling you again, because Ahmose finds fresh outrage in the story every time he tells it. The assessor valued his output at 20% more than his actual production, which means his tax obligation exceeded his means, which means he had to negotiate a deferred payment arrangement with the local tax office, which created paperwork, which required the services of a scribe, which cost him additionally. You listen with the expression of someone who has heard this story 11 times and is capable of inserting the appropriate sympathetic sounds at the correct intervals without fully engaging the conscious mind. This is a skill that Theban neighbors develop early. The argument for the taxes, that they fund the temples, the army, the civil administration, the flood management infrastructure, the granaries that feed people when the harvest fails, and the monument building projects that employ craftsmen and laborers across the whole country, Amos already knows and dismisses with the practiced efficiency of a man who has pre-refuted it. You do not make this argument. You are going to the market. The market is open. You have things to buy. You leave Amos mid-sentence and head toward the sound of commerce. The market. The Theban market is not a market in the sense you might picture from a European medieval town, with stalls and currency and prices chalked on boards. Egypt doesn't use coinage. Not yet. Not for centuries. What Egypt uses is a sophisticated, reasonably standardized system of barter, built around a unit of value called the deben, originally a specific weight of copper, about 91 grams, later extended as a conceptual unit against which all goods are valued. A deben of copper is the anchor. A loaf of bread is worth a calculable fraction of a deben of copper. A jar of oil, a pair of sandals, a length of linen, a fish, all have approximate standard values that shift slightly with supply and demand, and the vendor's mood on the day, but remain consistent enough to allow trade. This means that when you want to buy onions, you don't hand over coins. You work out what the onions are worth in deben equivalent, and then offer something of equivalent deben value. You might pay in grain, in oil, in a fragment of copper, in finished goods from your own work, or in a combination of things. The market vendor runs the same mental calculation from their end. Both parties agree or don't agree, and either trade or don't trade. This requires mental arithmetic of a kind that would exhaust a modern person accustomed to simply tapping a card. Egyptians do this arithmetic while simultaneously negotiating the price, checking the quality of the goods being offered in trade, managing social pleasantries with the vendor they've known for 20 years, avoiding stepping on a cat, critical, arguing with someone behind them about whether they were there first, and keeping track of what they still need to buy before returning home. Egypt is a civilization that invented mathematics, largely to support this kind of calculation. The administrative requirements of measuring fields, designing irrigation channels, building ramps, calculating grain storage, and running the most complex trading economy in the ancient world drove Egyptian mathematics to sophisticated places. Their multiplication method uses doubling sequences. Their geometry can calculate the volume of a truncated pyramid. Their fractions are expressed as unit fractions in a way that is slightly maddening to modern mathematicians, but worked perfectly well for several 1,000 years of practical application. The market is loud, dense, alive in the way that outdoor markets in warm climates are alive. Voices overlapping, the smells of fish and fresh bread and spiced oil, and the animals that are always somewhere nearby, contributing their opinions. The goods available here would surprise you if you expected an isolated, self-sufficient civilization. Egypt trades extensively and has done so for centuries. The market contains cedar wood from Lebanon, because Egypt has essentially no large timber trees and needs wood for everything from boats to furniture to coffins. Lapis lazuli from Afghanistan traveled through trade networks across Mesopotamia to arrive here as beads and inlay. tin from distant mines, necessary for bronze production, following routes that nobody fully understands yet, exotic animal skins, gold dust, and ebony from Nubia to the south, copper from Sinai, oil and wine from the Levantine coast, incense from Punt, somewhere on the Horn of Africa, whose precise location is known to the royal fleet captains and somewhat hazily to everyone else. And within this international abundance, onions, leeks, garlic, lentils, dried fish, fresh fish laid out on reed mats, glistening, a potter selling his morning's production of storage jars, a woman with loaves still warm from the oven, baskets of dates and figs, a man with copper tools, chisels, needles, pins, arranged on a cloth. You buy onions, you buy oil, a pot because yours cracked, a few dried fish for Bastet, who didn't ask, but who will act as though she expected this. You look at a length of very fine linen that a weaver has brought down from his workshop and correctly price it at approximately 3 times what you have available, and move on. On the way back, you pass the scribal school. The scribes. The scribal school is a covered courtyard attached to one of the smaller temple compounds, the House of Life, as these institutions are called, where sacred texts are copied, medical knowledge is maintained, and young boys learn to read and write under the direction of senior scribes who have been teaching for long enough that nothing surprises them anymore. The boys are seated in rows on reed mats, each with a flat-sided piece of limestone or broken pottery, cheaper than papyrus, plentiful as dust, and a brush and a small ink pot. They are copying texts. The copying of existing texts is the foundation of Egyptian scribal education. You copy religious documents, mathematical problems, model letters, literature. The act of copying teaches the signs, the grammar, the conventions of different types of writing, and the muscle memory of the brushstrokes. You are not studying the texts in the modern sense of critically analyzing their content. You are absorbing them through your hand. One of the boys, 9 years old, second row from the left, has ink on his face. He has ink on his nose, and a streak of it across his left cheekbone, and a mark on his ear that suggests he touched his ear with the brush hand while thinking, and the thinking went on somewhat longer than the drying time. His name is Amenhotep. His teacher, a compact, weathered man who has been producing competent scribes for 30 years and recognizes the type immediately, does not comment on the ink this morning. He commented yesterday. He will comment again next week when it is still happening. For now, he simply adjusts Amenhotep's brush grip and moves on. Amenhotep will have ink on his face at every appearance in this story. Consider this a standing feature. Consider it his brand. The scribal profession is the most comfortable and most strategically important occupation available to a non-noble Egyptian. Scribes run everything. Egypt runs on papyrus, and the papyrus runs on scribes, and there is no version of this civilization that functions without them. The armies have scribes managing logistics. The temples have scribes recording offerings and inventories. The courts have scribes documenting legal proceedings. The tax offices have scribes. The building projects have scribes. The royal palace has scribes. The granaries, the harbors, the mining expeditions, the diplomatic correspondence with foreign kingdoms, all of it recorded, filed, referenced, audited by men with brushes and inkpots who learned their craft copying texts in schools exactly like this one. The Egyptian writing systems, and there are several, are among the most complex in the ancient world. Hieroglyphics, the formal system used on temple and tomb walls, contains several hundred signs used in combination as logograms. The sign means the thing. Phonetic indicators, the sign means a sound. And determinatives, the sign clarifies which meaning is intended from among several possibilities. Reading a hieroglyphic inscription requires knowing not just what the signs look like, but how they're combined and in what contexts. Day-to-day scribal work isn't done in hieroglyphics. It's done in hieratic, a flowing, cursive abbreviation of the hieroglyphic system, adapted for rapid brush writing on papyrus, much faster to write and legible to any trained scribe, regardless of their regional accent or dialect. Hieratic is the bureaucratic hand of Egypt, the language of tax records and legal documents and letters, and the absolutely enormous administrative apparatus that keeps 30 million people, 10,000 square miles of territory, and the most complex single-state economy in the ancient world, running year after year. There's a teaching text called the Satire of the Trades, and it is exactly what it sounds like. A document written by scribes, for trainee scribes, explaining in exhaustive and entertaining detail why every other profession is worse than being a scribe. The potter sits in mud, the farmer works in heat and pays taxes, the soldier is beaten and sleeps in the dirt, the sandal maker, Mose would be furious, stinks of leather. The barber shaves people until midnight. The washerman handles other people's laundry in water that contains things the washerman prefers not to think about. Only the scribe, the text concludes triumphantly, has real freedom, because his pen does the work and his knowledge is his wealth, and he sits in the shade while others labor in the sun. The scribes wrote this. They were not going to understate the case. Young Amenhotep, transferring another small quantity of ink from his brush to his forehead, is 20 years away from the freedom his teacher describes. For now, he copies. He copies and will keep copying until the signs are in his hands and his sleep and his dreams, until he is a scribe the way a musician is a musician, not because he thinks about it, but because it has become the shape his mind naturally takes. We need to talk about the gods. There is no understanding Egypt without them. And there is no brief way to do this, because Egypt has a lot of gods. The working count for the New Kingdom period, depending on how you handle regional variants, syncretized deities, and the difference between a name divine concept and a full cult deity, is somewhere between 2,000 and this has stopped being a countable number. They are not all equally important. They exist in a loose hierarchy, with the major cosmic deities at the top and highly specialized local spirits at the bottom, and the middle ground is occupied by a cast of divine personalities so varied and fascinating that even a modern person who has no investment in ancient religion can spend several hours reading about them and emerge genuinely charmed. At the top, Ra, the sun god, who traverses the sky each day in his solar bark and battles the serpent Apophis each night to rise again in the morning. Ra, in his morning form, is Khepri, the scarab beetle, representing the sun being rolled across the sky as the dung beetle rolls its ball. Ra, in his evening form, is Atum, the setting sun, the completed cycle. This division of a single entity into multiple aspect deities for different phases of its existence is very Egyptian. The thing remains the thing, but its different manifestations have different names and slightly different relationships with the world. Amun, king of the gods, favored deity of Thebes and of the new kingdom pharaohs, has been merged with Ra to become Amun-Ra, which is both a political act. The Theban god absorbs the prestige of the solar deity, and a genuine theological statement about the nature of divine power. Then there's the family at the center of Egypt's most important myth cycle, Osiris, murdered by his brother Set, reassembled by his wife Isis, father of Horus, who avenges him and becomes the rightful king of Egypt. Every pharaoh is Horus in life. Every dead pharaoh becomes Osiris. This is not metaphor. This is the actual theological structure of Egyptian kingship, and it means that the entire government of Egypt is, at a foundational level, a drama about divine succession being played out correctly. Set, the villain of this particular story, is more complicated than villain suggests. He's the god of chaos, storms, the desert, foreign lands, and disruption, all necessary forces in the Egyptian worldview, because the Nile floods disruptively. The storms clear the air. The desert is a border that protects Egypt from invasion. Set is dangerous and necessary. He sails on Ra's solar bark and defends it from Apophis during the nightly underworld journey. Good and evil are, in Egyptian theology, not a binary. They're a balance to be maintained. Thoth has the head of an ibis. He governs writing, knowledge, time, and the moon. He invented hieroglyphics, according to tradition, and keeps the divine records. He presides over the weighing of the heart in the afterlife. The ibis head comes from observation. Ibises move slowly, deliberately, appear to be reading something in the mud as they probe with their curved bills. This is what a god of knowledge looks like to a people who watch birds carefully. The alternative form of Thoth is a baboon, also associated with knowledge, because baboons are observably clever and make a distinctive sound at dawn that was interpreted as greeting the rising sun. Hathor has the head of a cow, or sometimes appears as a woman with cow's ears, or horns framing a solar disk. She governs love, beauty, music, motherhood, and joy. She is also the goddess of beer, specifically of a brew made with mandrake and a particular date wine, and the patron deity of foreign lands that Egypt trades with. That love and beer should share a divine patron is the kind of association that suggests the Egyptians understood certain truths about human nature that hold up across 3,000 years. Sobek has the head of a crocodile. He governs the Nile, the flood, fertility, and military power. He is worshipped particularly wherever crocodiles are abundant, which is to say, along most of the Nile. His sacred animals are kept in temple pools and fed choice cuts of meat and adorned with jewelry. Crocodile attacks on people who worked the riverbanks were common enough that having a specific crocodile deity to petition made practical sense. Whether Sobek prevented crocodile attacks is impossible to assess, The crocodiles continued existing, which is something. Sekhmet has the head of a lioness. She is the goddess of war, plague, medicine, and healing. The same force that creates disease also cures it. The same violent energy that destroys can protect. Her priestesses were specialists in medicine, particular in the management of epidemics, and in the use of the knives of Sekhmet, surgical instruments. A specialist physician working under her patronage was, in practical terms, a plague doctor with both divine authority and empirical medical training, which is a useful combination. Bastet, your cat, is the domestic form of this leonine divine energy, where Sekhmet is the fierce lioness. Bastet, formerly Bast, is the protective household cat associated with home, fertility, music, and children. She was originally depicted with a lion's head and gradually, over centuries, acquired the domestic cat's appearance as cats became integrated into Egyptian households. Sacred cats were kept in her temple at Bubastis in the Delta. Their death was a national occasion of mourning. Killing one, even accidentally, was a capital offense in certain periods. The cat knows this. Cats have always known this. Audimai. Tetati Kise Temple. The temples of Thebes are not what modern people picture when they hear the word temple. You're imagining a place of worship. Somewhere the faithful gather to pray, to hear teachings, to be spiritually nourished in a congregational sense. A church, a mosque, a community gathering place. That is not what an Egyptian temple is, and as Egyptian temple is a god's house. Literally, the statue inside the inner sanctuary, and every temple has one, housed in a small, sealed dark room at the heart of the building that the Egyptians call the naos, is not a representation of the god or a focus for contemplation. It is, through a ritual called the opening of the mouth, the actual earthly residence of the divine presence. The god lives there. The statue is not a symbol. It is a dwelling. And a god's house operates on exactly the same logic as any great household in Egypt. There are servants who perform regular duties. There is a domestic schedule of meals and grooming and rest. Access is controlled by rank, and the household economy is substantial. Every morning before dawn, the officiant priest approaches the sealed inner sanctuary. He is fasting, freshly bathed, ritually pure, wearing clean linen. He breaks the clay seal that was applied to the door the previous evening and enters alone into the darkness. He opens the shrine that encloses the statue. He speaks ritual words of greeting and awakening. He anoints the statue with oil. He removes its clothing. The divine image is dressed in actual miniature garments of fine linen and replaces it with fresh linen. He applies kohl to the statue's eyes. He burns incense. He presents small ritual vessels of food and drink, bread, beer, meat, vegetables, all the things a great person would be offered at morning. The god is fed, clothed, and prepared for the day. This is not theater, though it is theatrical. This is maintenance. The divine presence in the statue is real, requires sustenance and attention, and will not function properly for Egypt if neglected. The entire system, the elaborate temple buildings, the priestly hierarchy, the vast temple estates that fund it all, the The political power of the high priests exists to maintain this contract. The gods are cared for. The gods care for Egypt. Egypt continues. Ordinary Egyptians do not see this happen. The inner sanctuary is closed to all but the highest ranking priests. The outer courts of the temple complex, the large open spaces inside the main pylons, are technically accessible for certain festivals and processions, but the working holy of holies is private. The closest most people get to their gods is the processional. Several times a year, on major festival days, the god's statue is placed in a gilded bark, a portable wooden shrine shaped like a boat, carried on the shoulders of shaved priests down the processional avenues of the city. The bark stops at stations along the route, and the movement of the statue, in response to questions shouted from the crowd, constitutes an oracle. Yes means the bark lurches forward. No means it pulls back. Questions about legal disputes, business decisions, guilt or innocence in criminal matters, all submitted to the oracle. The oracle's decisions are recorded by scribes. Amenhotep, 20 years from now, will record several dozen such decisions in a career spanning exactly this kind of temple administration, and treated as binding. The temple also runs a substantial economy. Temple estates, granted by royal decree and accumulated over centuries, include farmland, fishing rights, orchid gardens, workshops producing linen and processed food, herds of cattle, and flocks of geese. The offerings presented to the god each day, quantities that at major temples like Karnak are staggering, hundreds of loaves and jars of beer and whole roasted birds, are eventually redistributed to the priests and workers after the god has taken the spiritual essence. The physical substance remains. It feeds the temple staff, supports the laborers, maintains the infrastructure. The temple is a state institution, an economic powerhouse, a ritual center, and a community employer simultaneously. The high priest of Amun at Karnak, the person responsible for the daily care of the most important deity in the most important city in the wealthiest country in the known world, is, at this moment, in the new kingdom, among the most powerful human beings alive. He is not pharaoh, he is not a general, but he controls the estate of a god who owns, by conservative estimate, a significant fraction of Egyptian agricultural land, and that makes him the kind of person that even Ramesses has to keep in mind. The pharaoh. We should talk about Ramesses II, Ramesses the Great, as history will call him, partly because of his genuine accomplishments, and partly because he ensured there was no other possible interpretation by the simple and effective strategy of putting his name on everything. Is at this point in our story, roughly 30 years old, newly crowned, and already making his mark on the world with the confidence of a man who has never experienced a moment of doubt about his own importance. This is not entirely his fault. He is, by theological definition, the living incarnation of Horus on earth, son of Ra, keeper of Ma'at, the divine order of justice and truth that holds the universe together. Being told you are the divine pivot point of cosmic order from the moment of your birth does things to a person. It did things to most of the pharaohs. In Ramesses' case, it produced a man of genuine energy and ability, whose relationship with modesty was strained at the best of times. He will, over the course of a 67-year reign, he will live to his 90s, outliving multiple heirs, and watching his younger sons scramble for the succession, commission more statues of himself than any other pharaoh in Egyptian history. He will have his own name and images added to monuments that his predecessors built, replacing their dedications with his own, with the confidence of a man who believes he has improved everything he has touched. He will have a battle that ended in a carefully negotiated military stalemate. The Battle of Kadesh against the Hittite Empire. Roughly 3 years from now, commemorated in temple reliefs and official poetry as a magnificent personal triumph on the grounds that he led his forces personally, was technically not killed or captured, and fought on while surrounded, which, considered generously, is accurate. He will negotiate the first known peace treaty in recorded history with the Hittite king Hattusili III and have it carved on temple walls in both Egyptian hieroglyphics and Akkadian cuneiform, which is excellent from a documentation perspective. He will build Abu Simbel, 465-foot statues of himself carved directly into a sandstone cliff face in Nubia, inside which 2 temples of extraordinary scale are carved, oriented so that on 2 specific days of the year, the 20th of February and the 20th of October, which are believed to correspond to his coronation and birthday, the rising sun penetrates the entire length of the tunnel and illuminates the inner sanctuary, lighting the statues of the gods seated there, except for the statue of Ptah, god of the underworld, who remains in darkness because he is Ptah, and darkness is his thing. Abu Simbel will be carved for roughly 20 years by people who were probably not entirely sure this was going to work out until it suddenly did. He will have somewhere between 45 and 100 children, depending on whose count you accept, from a roster of principal wives and secondary wives and concubines that the official record tracks with the same administrative thoroughness applied to the grain supply. When Ramesses passes through Thebes on the royal barge, the golden canopy raised, priests burning incense on the quay, the city turning out to stand on the banks and watch the living God pass, you feel it. The scale of what he represents, the accumulated weight of 3,000 years of a civilization that has maintained, essentially without interruption, the idea that the person standing under that golden canopy is the linchpin of divine order on earth. It is not subtle. It is not meant to be. This is Egypt. Subtlety is for civilizations that can't afford stone. The Nile. The Nile is not just a river. Calling the Nile a river, in the same way you'd call the Thames a river, is accurate in the strict geographic sense and completely inadequate in every other sense. The Nile is Egypt. There is no version of this civilization. No pyramids, no temples, no pharaohs, no scribes, no beer, no bastet, without the Nile. It is the only reason this landscape is livable. It is the only reason Egypt is Egypt rather than an extension of the Sahara Desert, which is what most of the surrounding territory is. Here is what the Nile does annually, on a schedule so reliable that the Egyptians built their entire calendar around it. Between June and September, the White Nile and Blue Nile converging at Khartoum in what is currently called Nubia and flowing north, swell with the seasonal rains of the Ethiopian highlands. The Blue Nile in particular carries enormous quantities of water and, crucially, of silt. The fine, dark sediment eroded from the highlands and carried downstream in suspension. This water reaches Egypt and the Nile overflows its banks, inundating the floodplain on both sides to a depth that varies by year, but typically submerges the agricultural land along the river's course for several months. When the water recedes, it leaves behind a layer of black silt, dark, fine, extraordinarily fertile, deposited uniformly across the floodplain. This silt renews the agricultural soil every single year with no human intervention, no fertilizer, no crop rotation, no irrigation systems from distant water sources. The Nile floods, the Nile deposits, the Nile recedes. The planting season begins. Egypt grows grain in this renewed soil and has been doing so for 5,000 years, producing surpluses that feed not just Egypt, but the entire Eastern Mediterranean in good years. The ancient Egyptians divided their world into two kinds of land with an elegance that reflects a genuine geographic reality. Kemet, the Black Land, the fertile Nile Valley named for the color of the silt. Deshret, the Red Land, the desert, the rest of everything, hostile and barren and entirely clear about its indifference to human plans. The boundary between them is sometimes a matter of feet. You can stand in a field of wheat growing in black soil and see the edge of the sand where the flood never reached. On one side, life. On the other, everything that life is not. The flood, called Akhet, the season of inundation, the first season of the Egyptian year, is not a disaster. It is not an emergency. It is a gift, understood as such, personified as the god Happy, who is depicted as a plump, blue-skinned figure carrying laden offering trays, his belly and breasts generous with abundance. Happy is fat, and this is good. Happy's abundance means the fields fill. A thin Happy means the flood was low, the silt deposit thin, the harvest reduced. A Happy who doesn't show up at all means famine. And Egypt has experienced this enough times to have developed a theology and an administrative system around storing grain from the good years to survive the bad ones. The origin, quite possibly, of the biblical story of Joseph and Pharaoh's 7 fat cows and 7 lean cows, which records an Egyptian agricultural reality accurately enough that archaeologists can recognize the reference. The Nile is also the highway. This is not a secondary point. Egypt is a long, thin country. The habitable strip along the river is rarely more than a few miles wide, stretching 800 miles from the delta to the first cataract at Aswan. Without river transport, this country is ungovernable. With it, it functions as a single entity because goods, people, and information move easily along the river in both directions. You sail south. The prevailing north wind fills your sail. You travel north. The current carries you downstream. The same wind that pushes boats upriver prevents them from going downriver without turning. The Nile provides both a highway and a natural traffic management system. Egypt did not design this. Egypt simply inhabited it and understood it. Oh, citizen, the physician who passes your street most mornings is a compact, deliberate man named Userhat, and he is, within the limits of what medicine can achieve in 1279 BC, quite good at his job. Egyptian medicine is, by the standards of the ancient world, impressively rational. The Egyptians do not explain illness primarily as divine punishment, random misfortune, or the influence of malevolent supernatural forces, although those explanations exist alongside the medical ones and practitioners blend them. But as conditions with identifiable causes and treatable symptoms, they have medical papyri compiled from centuries of case notes that read with a structure a modern clinician would recognize. This is what I observe. This is what I interpret it to mean. This is what I expect will happen. This is what I recommend. The Edwin Smith Papyrus, which won't be excavated and read for another 3,000 years, but which exists right now in a rolled-up copy in a temple library somewhere in Thebes, contains 48 case studies of wounds and injuries, mostly from military and construction contexts. Each case is documented, examination findings, diagnosis, prognosis, an ailment I will treat, an ailment I will contend with, an ailment not to be treated, meaning hopeless, stated plainly without euphemism, and treatment. It is the earliest known surgical text, and it reads, "Across 3 millennia, as the work of a careful empirical observer who understood that cracked skulls and fractured vertebrae and severed tendons were mechanical problems requiring mechanical interventions, not exclusively spiritual ones. The Egyptians understand anatomy from mummification, which they have been practicing for centuries, and which requires the removal and treatment of specific organs. They know the liver, lungs, stomach, and intestines exist, and can be distinguished from each other. They remove these during mummification and store them separately in canopic jars, each protected by a different deity, each preserved specifically. They know the heart is at the center of the circulatory system, because when you cut the heart, everything stops. They are somewhat uncertain about the brain. Important texts suggest they consider it something of a filler, secondary to the heart as the seat of thought and personality, which is why the brain is removed during mummification by inserting a hooked tool through the nostril and pulled out through the nasal cavity, discarded rather than preserved, because you need your heart in the afterlife, and you don't need whatever was going on in your skull. The brain, as it turns out, is quite important, but the heart is not wrong as a central metaphor. Some treatments are genuinely excellent. Honey for wound dressing, used extensively, packed into wounds and covered with linen, has real antibacterial properties that modern research has confirmed. Honey's low water content, acidic pH, and hydrogen peroxide production create an environment hostile to infection-causing bacteria. And Egyptian surgeons were using it correctly based entirely on the observation that wounds treated with honey healed better. Willow bark for pain relief contains salicin, which the body converts to salicylic acid, the active compound of aspirin. And the Egyptians prescribed it for headaches and pain with consistent effectiveness for the same reason modern aspirin works. Castor oil as a purgative, effective. Garlic and onion preparations for infections, modestly effective due to allicin's antimicrobial properties. Copper compounds for wound infections, effective. And then the other category, dead mice, ground to paste, for burns and wounds. This is a remedy appearing in multiple papyri and is not effective, but the repetition across sources suggests it was genuinely tried and genuinely believed to help, which is the most charitable interpretation available. Crocodile dung for gynecological purposes. The logic here may have been partially contraceptive. The alkaline pH of the dung might have had some effect, though this is speculative and the risks of the approach seem to substantially outweigh any benefit. Fat from 6 animals: lion, hippopotamus, crocodile, goose, snake, ibex, combined and applied to the scalp for baldness. This does not work. It is not going to work. The baldness is not impressed by any of these animals. But as a statement of intent, as a declaration that the preparer was willing to source materials from 6 increasingly dangerous species in service of hair restoration, it has a certain commitment to it. User Hat, your physician, knows all of this. He prescribes what works when he can, and what tradition suggests when he cannot do better. And he does not charge you for opinions he hasn't earned, which is more than you can say for some practitioners. The royal court has, among its specialist physicians, a practitioner whose official title on his administrative records is Shepherd of the Royal Anus. This is a proctologist. This is a real title on a real inscribed stone. The Shepherd of the Royal Anus has been preserving his dignity in this inscription for 3,000 years and will continue to do so indefinitely. History has no mercy. The afterlife. This is what Egypt is actually thinking about. Under everything, at all times, quietly running, as a background process beneath daily life, the way a constant awareness of death runs in every culture, but with more administrative infrastructure. Not death itself. Egyptians are not morbid about dying as an event. They don't fear death the way cultures more uncertain about what follows it do. What they think about, with the focused attention of people who have had 30 centuries to refine the theology, is what comes after, and it is complex enough to require a guide. The Egyptian concept of the person is more granular than the modern Western soul. You don't have a soul. You have several components, each with different properties and different afterlife requirements. The key is your vital force, your life energy, which lives in the tomb after death and requires sustenance. The food offerings left at tomb chapels are for the Ka, which consumes their spiritual essence. The Ba is something like individual personality and consciousness, depicted as a human-headed bird that can leave the tomb during the day, move through the world of the living, and must return to the body at night. The Ak is the integrated, perfected being that the deceased becomes after successful passage through the afterlife. The final form, the blessed dead existing in the field of reeds. The Ren is the name. A person's name is an actual component of their being, which is why preserving the name in inscriptions is so important, why speaking the name of the dead is considered a form of keeping them alive, and why Ramesses is so aggressively carving his name on everything. He is conducting a 3,000-year personal continuity project with considerable foresight. The journey after death leads to the Hall of Two Truths. In this hall, a vast lit space that Egyptian art depicts with the confident specificity of an architectural drawing, the deceased stands before a panel of 42 divine assessors and declares their innocence of a specific list of sins. The negative confession, it's called. I have not stolen. I have not killed unjustly. I have not cheated the grain measure. I have not spoken maliciously. 42 declarations, each addressed to a different divine judge, covering the full range of ethical violations that Egyptian society has identified as significant. Then Anubis, the jackal-headed god of embalming and the dead, who guides the deceased through the underworld with the focused competence of a customs official who has processed everyone who has ever died, takes the heart and places it on a scale. On the other side of the scale, a feather, a single white ostrich feather, the symbol of Ma'at, truth, justice, the proper order of things. If the heart is lighter than the feather, if the person lived rightly, treated others fairly, maintained Ma'at in their life, the scale tips appropriately, and the deceased is declared justified, vindicated, worthy. Thoth records the result with his scribal equipment. Thoth is always recording something. It is his whole purpose. The deceased proceeds to the field of reeds, the Egyptian paradise, which is Egypt with ideal floods, perfect harvests, no taxes, and all the people you loved, waiting for you on the riverbank. If the heart is heavier than the feather, full of sin, full of accumulated injustice, a creature waits beside the scale. Its name is Amit, the devourer, the bone eater, constructed from the three most dangerous animals in Egypt: the head of a crocodile, the forequarters of a lion or leopard, the hindquarters of a hippopotamus. Amit's sole function is to eat the hearts that fail the weighing. And if Amit eats your heart, you do not go to a place of punishment. You do not suffer eternally. You simply cease to exist. This, to the Egyptian mind, is the genuine horror. Not pain, not punishment, non-existence. The end of the name, the end of the Ka, the end of the Ba, the end of everything that was you. The Egyptians looked at oblivion and found it worse than any hell they could imagine. And they were correct that it is worse. And they built an entire civilization's worth of theology and infrastructure around the project of avoiding it. The Ikai, Ushapti figures placed in tombs, small mummy-shaped figurines made of blue faience or wood or stone, are inscribed with a spell from the Book of the Dead that activates them when the deceased is called to do agricultural labor in the afterlife. O Ushabti, the spell says approximately, if the deceased is called upon to do any work that is done in the land of the dead, to cultivate the fields, to irrigate the riverbanks, to carry sand from east to west, you shall say, "Here I am, I will do it." Every tomb needs enough Ushapti to answer for every day of the year, plus additional foreman Ushapti to manage the workers. A wealthy New Kingdom official might be buried with 365 worker Ushapti and 36 foremen. They outsourced their afterlife chores with the same administrative efficiency they applied to everything else. Families. You return home in the mid-afternoon, paint-stained and tired. You are an artist, a tomb painter, specifically, attached to a workshop that takes commissions from wealthy Theban officials and minor nobility for tomb decoration. You spend your working days in the necropolis hillsides on the west bank, painting the walls of underground chambers with the banquet scenes and hunting scenes and offering bearer processions and agricultural vignettes that are meant to sustain the eternal life of whoever commissioned the work. Egyptian art follows strict canonical rules that took centuries to develop, and that every painter learns before they're allowed to work on actual tombs, Figures are drawn with the face in profile, but the eye shown frontally, because the eye must be fully visible to see. The torso faces forward while the legs and feet face sideways, because both the full breadth of the shoulders and the clear direction of movement must be legible. The most important figure in any scene is the largest, regardless of perspective. Horizontal registers separate scenes like comic panels. The colors have fixed conventional meanings: red ochre for male skin, yellow for female, blue-green for water. The precise turquoise blue that the Egyptians manufactured specifically for painting, a compound of copper, calcium, and silica, heated to produce a color that didn't exist in nature until they invented it, for symbolic elements. You know all of this the way a musician knows scales. It is built into you. You don't decide where the feet go. You decide how the fabric falls, how the offerings are arranged, how the duck that lifts from the painted marsh tilts its wing. Within the canon, there is enormous room for the difference between a competent painting and one that breathes. Nefret, your wife, is in the courtyard when you arrive home, mending a length of linen with the focused efficiency of someone who has been doing this since childhood and doesn't require full conscious attention for it. She is a practical, warm, occasionally sharp-tongued woman who manages the household with the kind of quiet competence that Egyptian society depends on, but doesn't document particularly well, because the scribes mostly write about what happens outside the home, and the home is where women run things. Egyptian women have a legal standing that their contemporaries in Greece and Rome decidedly don't. They can own property outright in their own name. They can enter contracts, bring lawsuits, and testify in court. They can inherit, bequeath, and manage estates. They can initiate divorce, a procedure that in Egypt is less a legal proceeding than a social arrangement, concluded by negotiation and witnessed by a scribe, with property divided according to the marriage contract. Nefret knows exactly what she owns, what you own jointly, and what would happen to both in the event of any marital change. She mentions this occasionally with the mild confidence of someone who has read the papyrus. Ka is 8, your son, named for the mountain horizon in whose shadow, metaphorically, all important things happen. He will go to scribal school next year if he demonstrates sufficient aptitude, which he will, because Ka is the kind of child who notices everything and remembers it, and then uses the information at unexpected moments. He is currently in the street outside, arguing with the neighbor's son about a wooden ball in a way that will either resolve itself or escalate to a level requiring adult involvement. Merit is 5, your daughter, who chose her own name at an age when most children are still working out the relationship between cause and effect. Merit means beloved, which she is, and which she is fully aware of, and which she uses occasionally as leverage. She has developed, in the last several months, a close and apparently mutually satisfying relationship with Bastet, based on their shared interest in being stroked, consuming fish, and sitting in the sunny patch of the courtyard in the late afternoon. They spend portions of most afternoons there together. Whether Bastet tolerates this or actively seeks it is unclear. The effect is the same: crime and punishment. Not all of Thebes is pleasant, and Egyptian justice, while organized, is not gentle. Egypt has a functioning court system. The Kenbet, a local tribunal composed of officials and respected citizens who hear civil disputes, higher state courts for serious matters, and it has a comprehensive body of law grounded in the concept of ma'at. Justice is not arbitrary. Precedent matters. Both parties have the right to be heard. Scribes record proceedings and produce written judgments that can be appealed. Minor disputes, a boundary argument between neighbors, a debt unpaid, a contract not honored, the eternal Nile-adjacent question of whose field the flood boundary moved in which direction, go to the local kenbet and are resolved relatively quickly, usually in favor of whoever has the better papyrus documentation, which is why scribes get paid and why Amos's repeated complaints about his tax assessment have technically gone nowhere because he doesn't have a scribe and the tax office does. Serious crimes have serious consequences. Theft at meaningful scale, repayment of multiple times the stolen value plus beating. The beating is administered officially and documented. It is not private violence. It is the instrument of the state. Assault. Beating proportional to severity. Certain categories of assault. Mutilation of the offending body part, which the Egyptians applied with a straightforward logic. If the hand offends, the hand is addressed. Murder. Execution, with the method varying by severity of the case and the status of the parties involved. Tomb robbery is treated as the most serious crime available. This makes sense. Robbing a tomb is not just theft. It is the destruction of an eternal existence. You are stealing the objects that sustain the Ka. You may be destroying the body, which the Bia needs to return to. You may be erasing the name inscriptions, which are a component of the person's continued being. Tomb robbery is, in Egyptian terms, murder extended beyond death. You are killing someone who has already died and is trying to continue. The penalties reflect this gravity: amputation, impalement, execution. The law is severe, and the deterrent is explicit. And yet, the tombs were robbed, repeatedly, systematically, in some cases within years of their sealing. The workers who cut and plastered and painted the tombs in the Valley of the Kings, the people who knew where the walls were thinner, which passages connected to which chambers, where the valuables were concentrated, sometimes returned. Not all of them, not always, but often enough that the valley's security history is, when examined, somewhat embarrassing for a civilization with this level of administrative capability. There are trial records, actual papyrus documents from later in this dynasty recording the investigation and prosecution of organized tomb robbing rings, including testimony from workers who confessed to robbing the royal tombs and splitting the proceeds with officials who were supposed to be guarding them. The papyri, names. They describe the division of the gold. They are some of the most human documents in the Egyptian archive, and they prove that the gap between the ideal of eternal inviolability and the practical reality of human greed is as old as the impulse to build anything worth stealing. The eternal, it turns out, required constant maintenance. Evening. The sun is dropping toward the western cliffs, toward the Valley of the Dead, toward the place where Ramesses' predecessors are buried, and where his own tomb is already being cut, and Thebes shifts into a different register. The market is winding down. The fishermen are bringing in their last catches. The craftsmen's workshops are quieting. On the river, the evening traffic has a different Character from the morning, more personal, less commercial. The small boats of people crossing from the West Bank after their day's work in the necropolis or the mortuary temples. From the direction of Karnak, faintly, the beginning of the evening rituals, the reverse of the morning sequence, the god being prepared for night, the doors being sealed, the clay impression of the priest's seal pressed into the wet clay over the door, so that no unauthorized opening can occur in darkness without leaving evidence. You walk home through streets that smell of bread baking and cooking fires, and the warm dust that the evening air stirs up before the temperature drops. The palm tree in your courtyard makes its small sound in the light wind off the river. Your neighbor Amos, emerging from his workshop with the end-of-day expression of a man who has stood in his feelings about taxation for 6 consecutive hours, nods and does not, this time, say anything. You nod back. This is the most peaceful interaction you have had with Amos this week. Nefret has made lentils, thick, spiced with cumin and coriander, ladled into clay bowls, with flatbread from this afternoon's baking and roasted onions and a dish of olive oil for dipping. It is the kind of meal that is not elaborate, but is exactly what a tired body wants at the end of an afternoon of painting. You eat together in the front room, the 4 of you, and Bastet, who receives her portion first, and retires to the corner with the proprietorial satisfaction of a being who has arranged things to her preferred specification. After dinner, in the courtyard, with the first stars appearing over the flat rooftop and the evening cool coming off the river, you tell Ka the story of Ra and Apophis. Every night, the sun god Ra boards his solar bark and travels through the underworld, the Duat, the 12-hour kingdom of night, on his way to rise again in the east. And every night the serpent Apophis, the embodiment of chaos and non-being, a creature of such fundamental destructiveness that it has no temple, no worshippers, no cult. You do not worship Apophis, you simply fight it, attacks the bark, and attempts to prevent the sunrise. Ra and his crew, including Set, who turns out to be useful here, chaos fighting chaos, battle Apophis through the night. Every night, Ra wins. Every morning, the sun rises. The victory is never final. Tomorrow night, Apophis will be waiting again. Ka listens with the complete attention that children bring to stories that are genuinely frightening and genuinely wonderful simultaneously. He wants to know if Apophis has ever won. You tell him no, because if Apophis won, there would be no morning. He considers this. He accepts it. He asks whether Set is a bad god. You tell him that Set is a necessary god, which is not the same thing. This takes more explaining, and by the time you reach a version of the answer that satisfies an 8-year-old, Merit is asleep against Bastet's flank, and the stars are fully out. The stars and the night. You know the stars. Egypt knows the stars in the way that a civilization organized around agriculture and the flood cycle must know them. Not as decoration, but as a calendar. The heliacal rising of Sirius, the brightest star in the sky, which appears above the eastern horizon just before dawn after a period of invisibility, announces the coming flood season with a consistency that Egyptian astronomers have been tracking for centuries. This rising, called the New Year in the oldest traditions, is so precisely correlated with the beginning of the flood that Sirius and the Nile are understood as connected. The stars rising calls the waters. This is not quite astronomy and not quite meteorology And in a sense, it doesn't matter which, because the correlation is real and the observation is correct. The temples are oriented to stellar events. Karnak, the great Amun complex, is aligned with the midwinter sunrise. On the solstice, the light enters the main axis of the temple and illuminates the innermost sanctuary with an accuracy that the builders achieved without instruments that survive but must have involved extraordinary observation and calculation over generations. The Egyptians mapped the sky into daishans, 36 groups of stars that rise at 10-day intervals throughout the year, each governing one 10-day period. This is the origin of our own week. The Egyptian decan-based system, passing through Hellenistic astronomy, gives us 7-day weeks, 24-hour days, 60-minute hours. Every time you say it's 2:15 in the afternoon, you're using a timekeeping framework that an Egyptian astronomer calculated around 4,000 years ago. You stand on your rooftop in the full dark of the Egyptian night, a dark that modern people in lit cities have completely lost access to, and the sky is extraordinary. The Milky Way is visible in its full structure, the band of it arcing from horizon to horizon. The ancient Egyptians see the Milky Way as the body of the sky goddess Nut, arched over the earth. The stars are her body. The sun travels through her during the night, swallowed at sunset and reborn at sunrise from her belly. The Egyptians were wrong about the mechanism and right about the wonder. Sleep, you carry Merit to bed. She does not stir. 3 years old, she stopped waking up for transitions, and she is that rare person who passes through sleep stages without ever surfacing. A skill you envy, lying awake on your headrest with the sound of the city settling around you. Ka is upstairs already, resistant about bedtime in the way that children have been resistant about bedtime in every civilization in recorded and unrecorded history, including this one 3,000 years ago, because the biological stubbornness of an 8-year-old at bedtime is one of the few true universals. He was still awake when you came upstairs. He will be asleep within 6 minutes. This is also a universal. The oil lamp burns low on its stand. Not for fear of the dark exactly, though the night has its qualities and a lamp is company. More because the complete darkness of an Egyptian bedroom without any light source at all is the kind of dark that makes the walls disappear, and you prefer to see the walls. You adjust your headrest to the familiar position, the specific angle that your neck has learned over years into something comfortable in the way that only deeply familiar discomforts become comfortable, and listen to the city winding down. A dog down the street, doing what dogs have done at night since the first dog decided that night was the right time for opinions. The Nile, which you can't quite hear from here, but whose presence you can feel the way you feel the presence of any large thing. A weight of water in the direction of the river, the slight humidity in the air, the quality of the darkness on that side, someone's donkey 2 streets over, registering a philosophical objection to the hour. From the direction of Karnak, if you strain, a quality of torchlit silence that is the specific texture of a large stone building at night, when the people who tend it are performing rituals that will keep the sun rising until morning. You think about the tomb you painted today, the banquet scene on the north wall, the guests seated at their eternal feast, carrying lotus flowers with the careful hands you gave them, wearing the cone of perfumed fat on their wigs that will melt slowly in the heat of their perpetual dinner. their coal-lined eyes looking at the things the best eternal banquets always have to offer. You painted them with good lines and accurate colors, and the invisible care that separates adequate work from beautiful work. They are finished in a way that nothing in daily life ever really is. In 3,000 years, someone with a torch and a careful brush and artificial lights will clear the dust from that wall and find those guests still at their table, still celebrating, still carrying their lotus flowers. The man who commissioned the work will be dust in his canopic jars, and his name will be partially abraded from the cartouche, but the banquet will be going on. The paint holds, the limestone holds, the beautiful thing persists. This is why the Egyptians made the things they made, not because they were trying to show off, not because they had surplus labor and needed a project, because they understood, in the particular way of a civilization that has watched stone outlast everything else for 3,000 years, that making something beautiful was the closest you could get to making something that continued. Bastet arrives at the bed and claims the center of the sleeping surface with the quiet authority of a being who has never doubted her right to anything. She circles once, settles, and is asleep before you've finished, adjusting the headrest. She sleeps the way cats sleep, immediately and completely, as though sleep is not a transition, but a destination she reaches without effort, every time, a place she knows perfectly and returns to as easily as breathing. The lamp flickers. The city is quieter now. The Nile breathes in the dark. 30 centuries from now, someone will look at a photograph of the wall you painted today and feel, across the impossible distance, something like the warmth of a party they weren't invited to, but can stand outside and hear. They will feel this and not be sure why it moves them. It moves them because the hands that made it were warm, and the lamplight was exactly like this lamplight, and the bread had grit in it, and the beer was thick and not quite cold, and the cat slept in the middle of the bed, and the child was asleep, and the neighbor was annoyed about the taxes, and the Nile was full, and it was good. Closing. It's clear that living in ancient Egypt was not quite the golden paradise that the tomb paintings advertise. The paintings are propaganda, beautiful, exquisite, 3,000-year propaganda, commissioned by people who were not documenting their actual Tuesday, but pitching their eternal worthiness to a jury of divine assessors. The actual Tuesday had grit in the bread, and the taxes, and the headrest, and ahmos, and the smoke that has permanently migrated into the kitchen ceiling. And yet, there is something in the Egyptian way of existing in the world that defeats cynicism every time you try to apply it. They built for forever with a completeness of commitment that has no parallel. They invented writing and bureaucracy on approximately the same Tuesday, and they used them immediately to write love poems and grocery lists and complaint letters and the world's first medical case studies, which is every civilization in miniature and in sequence. They were afraid of Amit and the end of the name and the end of the person. They were not particularly afraid of death. They looked at the Nile and saw a God who brought the soil. They looked at the desert and saw the edge of the world. They looked at the stars and built their temples to catch the solstice sun. They also paid their taxes mostly. They also had terrible teeth. They also couldn't quite stop robbing each other's tombs. So as you drift off tonight, be grateful for your pillow, softer than carved acacia wood, engineered with no protective spell, but effective enough against scorpions by virtue of being a modern country where scorpions are not a bedroom concern. Be grateful for your filtration system and your fluoride toothpaste and the fact that your breakfast grain is milled by machines that do not shed grit into the flour. Be grateful for your dental plan, your clean water, and your ability to wear any color you want because nobody in your neighborhood is violently affiliated with a chariot racing faction. Spare a thought for Amenhotep the scribe, who spent 40 years with ink on his face and kept the records of a civilization in neat hieratic rows on papyrus that survived 3,000 years in a desert jar, and whose name is still legible in the margin of a grain delivery document in a museum somewhere. Proof that he existed, that he worked carefully, that the records were kept, and the grain was delivered, and the bread was made, and the beer was drunk, and the cat slept in the middle of the bed. Spare a thought for Amos, who was right about his taxes. Spare a thought for Bastet, who was right about everything. Ramesses built Abu Simbel to last forever, and it's still there, and his name is still on it, and the sun still enters the sanctuary on the 20th of February and illuminates the statues just as calculated. He was, whatever else, correct that stone endures. He was correct that if you put your name on enough things, you will be remembered. He never slept much either. He built things about it. Sleep well. Good night.